The silence did something they did not tell you it would do. Not the silence's strategy, not the calculated quiet of someone who read that pulling back creates attraction and deployed the technique with one eye on the clock and one eye on the phone. The other kind. The silence that arrived because you finally, genuinely, ran out of the energy required to keep reaching towards someone who kept making the reaching feel like a mistake. The silence that was not chosen so much as arrived at, the natural consequence of a person who gave everything available and discovered, in the emptiness that followed, that there was nothing left to give. That silence, the real one. It did something to them that you probably did not fully anticipate. Not because the effect is unpredictable, but because understanding it requires understanding what your presence, your consistent, available, reaching presence, was actually doing to the avoidance system while it was happening, what function it was serving, what the system was using it for, and what happens to a system when something it was using, without fully registering that it was using it, is no longer there. The return is not random. It is not the avoidant simply cycling back through the pattern on some predetermined schedule. It is the specific, psychologically coherent consequence of a system encountering the full weight of what your silence revealed about what your presence had been. This is the complete picture of why it happens, every layer of it. Start before the silence. Start with what was happening during the relationship that neither of you had clear language for. Your availability, the consistent, genuine, oriented toward them quality of your presence was doing something in the avoidance relational architecture that the avoidant was not consciously registering. It was functioning as a regulatory anchor. This is a specific psychological concept worth understanding precisely. An attachment figure who is consistently present and reliably responsive serves a regulatory function for the nervous system, not just emotionally, physiologically. The knowledge that someone is there, available, oriented toward you, creates a quality of baseline security that allows the nervous system to operate at a lower threat response level than it would in the absence of that anchor. For the avoidant, this regulatory function was complicated by the very architecture that made intimacy difficult. The same system that was pulling away from your closeness was simultaneously, and without the system's full acknowledgement, using your constancy as a background stabilizer. Your predictable availability, the fact of you being reliably there, reliably caring, reliably invested, was lowering the ambient threat level of the avoidant's daily experience in ways so subtle and consistent that the system stopped registering the lowering as caused by you. It became the baseline, invisible in the way that backgrounds become invisible, absorbed into the ordinary texture of existence without being recognized as a contribution. Your silence removed the contribution, and the removal of something that had been invisible through its consistency is experienced not as the absence of something optional, but as the sudden, disorienting presence of something essential that is now missing. The first days of your silence are, for the avoidant, indistinguishable from the relief the system expected. This matters to understand because the timeline of the return is longer than most people expect, and the delay is often interpreted as evidence that the return will not come. In those first days, the avoidance system is experiencing exactly what it was calibrated to experience in the absence of relational pressure. The activation quiets, the management protocols reduce their output. The specific exhaustion of navigating intimacy, even the suppressed, managed version of intimacy that the avoidant was permitting, lifts. The deactivating strategies, running unchallenged now that there is nothing to deactivate against, produce their familiar outputs. This is better. This is what was needed. The relationship was complicated in ways that distance is now simplifying. Independence feels like itself again, rather than like something being defended. The system settles. The relief is genuine. And then time continues. And the relief begins to develop texture. What develops in the texture of the relief is the specific, unignorable quality of your particular absence. Not absence in general, not the ordinary quiet of someone who is simply not currently present. Your absence, the specific negative space that has the exact shape and frequency of you. The particular quality of something missing that cannot be filled by the restored independence, because the independence never contained what you provided in the first place. The regulatory anchor was invisible while it was present. It is achingly legible now that it is gone. The avoidance nervous system, which was, throughout the relationship, running its management protocols against the perceived pressure of your closeness, now finds itself running those same protocols in the absence of anything to run them against. And protocols designed to manage an input experience a specific kind of malfunction when the input is removed. They keep activating without the stimulus. Keep preparing for something that is not arriving. Keep orienting toward a frequency that is no longer broadcasting. The system is searching for you, not consciously, not in the deliberate, acknowledged way of someone who has decided they miss you and wants you back. In the specific, pre-rational, below-articulation way of a nervous system that was organized around something and is now experiencing the disorganization of that something's removal. The searching is the beginning of the return. Long before the return is conscious. Long before the avoidant has any language for what they are experiencing. In the body, in the baseline quality of daily experience, in the specific flatness that has replaced the texture of before, the return is already beginning. Here is the psychological mechanism that makes the silence specifically more powerful than any other response. Your silence removes the object of the avoidant's primary defensive process. The management strategies, deactivation, distance maintenance, the suppression of attachment feeling, are not passive, they are active. They require something to work against. The ongoing presence of your warmth, your reaching, your available investment in the relationship was the input that the management strategies were organized around managing. They were deployed in response to you. They processed you. They were, in a fundamental sense, about you. Remove you and the strategies find themselves operational without a function. An active management system running without an object to manage does not simply turn off, it turns inward. And a management system directed inward at the avoidant's own interior rather than at an external relational input encounters material it is less equipped to process. The feeling that was being managed outward, managed against the pressure of your presence, suppressed in response to the activation that closeness produced, is now present without the outward orientation that gave the suppression its target. The feeling has nowhere to go except inward, into the direct experience of the avoidant's own interior. And the interior, encountered directly rather than through the mediating process of managing it against something external, is carrying more than the avoidance management system prepared for. It is carrying you. The full, unmanaged, undeactivated reality of what you meant, what you provided, what the constancy of your presence was doing that the constancy's removal is now making unmistakably clear. The dawning of what was lost does not arrive as a single moment of clarity. It arrives as an accumulation. Small, ordinary, unremarkable moments that carry, in the new landscape of your absence, a quality they did not carry before. The moment where something good happens and the impulse to share it with you arrives before the impulse can be intercepted. The moment where something difficult happens and the specific absence of your particular quality of response, not just any response, your response, registers as something the difficulty is now missing. The moment where something funny happens and the specific person who would have found it funny in the exact right way is not available to find it funny. Each of these moments is a point of contact with the specific reality of what you were. Not what you were as an abstract category of good relationship or caring person or consistent presence. What you were specifically. In the particular, irreplaceable, cannot be approximated by general continuation way of a specific human being who had a specific way of receiving the world and a specific quality of attention and a specific interior that is not reproducible anywhere else. The accumulation of these moments is what moves the avoidance experience of your absence from the general category of loss into the specific, undeniable recognition of what was lost. And the recognition of what was specifically lost is what the generalized deactivation cannot neutralize. Because generalized deactivation works on categories, on the general concept of the relationship and its general assessment as something that was not right, or not sustainable, or not worth the cost of the activation. Specific recognition defeats the generalized strategy by refusing to remain in the category. You are not a category. You are a person. And the recognition of the specific, particular, irreplaceable person defeats the generalized management strategy every time. Something happens in the avoidance relationship to their own narrative during the silence. The story they told to justify the distance, the narrative that the management system constructed to make the pattern feel reasonable, begins to require more maintenance than it previously required. The story needed less upkeep when the relationship was active, because the daily experience of managing the relational input provided constant renewal of the narrative's apparent evidence. The distance felt necessary because the closeness was continuously present and continuously activating. In the silence, the closeness is not present, the activation is not occurring, and the story that the distance was necessary, constructed in response to the activation, begins to run without the conditions that made it feel accurate. It starts to sound like what it is: a story, a constructed narrative, a management tool rather than an accurate account. The avoidant, sitting in the quiet of your absence without the relationship's daily texture to fill in the story's plausibility, finds the story increasingly difficult to sustain as lived truth. The justifications that felt self-evident while the relationship was active feel, in the retrospective clarity that your absence has created, less like insight and more like rationalization. Something is being recognized, not with the comfort of a clean realization, but with the specific discomfort of someone watching their own narrative lose credibility from the inside. This loss of narrative credibility is one of the primary forces driving the return. Because the story that justified the distance is no longer doing its job. And without the story, the distance is revealed as what it always was beneath the narrative. Not preference, not health, not the appropriate response of someone who values their independence and knows their own needs. Loss management. Preemptive protection against being hurt by the loss of something before the loss could arrive on its own terms. And the irony that the protection produced the very loss it was designed to prevent is not lost on the avoidant sitting in the silence that the protection created. The quality of the return, when it comes, reveals what produced it. This is how you can read the return accurately, rather than through the distorting lens of relief at its arrival. A return that comes early, in the first days or first couple of weeks, before the deeper psychological process has had time to run, is likely produced by the initial disruption of the system's regulatory anchor rather than by genuine recognition. The system noticed the anchor's absence and is reaching to restore it. The reaching, at this stage, is more about the system's comfort than about any meaningful insight into what produced the silence. This early return, if met with immediate full availability, simply restores the previous dynamic. The anchor is reinstated. The system recalibrates. The management protocols resume, and the pattern that produced the silence is now running again, with the added information that silence produces return, which is useful information for the system, but does not necessarily produce the change that would make the return sustainable. A return that comes later, after the process has had time to run its full course, after the specific recognition of what was lost has accumulated through the ordinary moments of daily life encountering the absence, after the narrative has lost sufficient credibility that the distance it was justifying has become harder to maintain, this return carries different material. It carries, at least potentially, the beginning of genuine recognition, of the pattern having been seen clearly enough to be named, of the specific person who was lost having been understood specifically enough that the return is organised around them, rather than around the system's need for restoration. The difference matters, not as a guarantee. Genuine recognition in the moment of return does not automatically translate into changed behaviour in the relationship that follows, but as the minimum necessary condition for something different to be possible. What the avoidant is experiencing in the period just before the return, in the specific internal landscape of someone who is about to reach out after having told themselves, and possibly others, that they had moved on, is worth understanding. There is a quality of having run out of the story, of the narrative that justified the distance having been exhausted, of the deactivating strategies having run so long without adequate input that they have depleted their own credibility, of sitting in the life that the distance was supposed to make comfortable and finding the comfort increasingly indistinguishable from emptiness. There is also fear. The specific fear of reaching, of reversing the distance, of making the reaching visible, of being in the position of someone who pulled away and is now pulling back and must somehow account for the arc in a way that is not humiliating. The avoidant reaching out after silence is not in a comfortable position. They are doing the thing the system most resists, moving toward rather than away, after having moved away. Which means the moving toward carries the additional weight of whatever the moving away revealed about them. This fear is real, and it matters to understand because it shapes the quality of the return. The return often does not say what it is, often arrives framed as something smaller, a question, a reference to something shared, a casual check-in that has been constructed to carry minimal visible stakes. Not because the reaching is not genuine, but because the reaching is terrifying, and the terrified person deploys the smallest viable form of the reach to test the temperature before committing to the full aversion. The small reach is the full feeling in its smallest available expression. Read it accordingly. Now, the most important part, the part that the psychology of why the return happens must eventually arrive at. The return is real. The feeling that produces it is real. The recognition of your specific value, the particular irreplaceable quality of what you brought that the silence finally made legible, is real. None of that means the return is sufficient. The avoidant returning does not constitute the evidence that the pattern has changed. The return is the evidence that the system registered your absence as loss, that the regulatory anchor was more significant than the management protocols allowed the system to acknowledge while you were providing it, that the deactivating strategies ran out of the narrative they needed to sustain the distance. These are real things. They matter. They are not nothing, but they are the beginning of a possible change, not the change itself. The system that registered the loss and produced the return is the same system that produced the pattern. It has been disrupted. It has been given information it could not generate while the pattern was running. It is in a different state than it was. Different state is not changed architecture. The architecture changes, if it changes, through the specific, sustained, internally motivated work that follows the recognition. Through the willingness to sit with the discomfort of what the recognition revealed about the pattern and its costs. Through the examination and the grieving and the slow revision of the self-understanding that the pattern was built on. The return is the invitation to that work, not the work itself. What you do with the return, if and when it arrives, is the most consequential decision in the entire dynamic. Not for the avoidant, for you, because you are not the same person who went silent. The silence did something to you too. It returned something, some quality of yourself that the perpetual reaching had quietly depleted. Some self-knowledge that the occupation of loving someone whose system resisted being loved had not left room for. Some clarity about what you need and what you will not organise yourself around again, and what the relationship would have to genuinely be in order for the return to lead somewhere different than the pattern. That clarity is yours. It does not belong to the dynamic. It does not get handed back when they return. Meeting the return from that clarity, from the specific, hard-won, genuinely possessed understanding of what you need and what you will not surrender to the familiar comfort of the restoration, is the only ground from which something genuinely different can be built. if something different is what you want. If it is not, if the honest accounting says that what you need is a life that does not include the particular weight of this dynamic in any configuration, then the return is something to receive with the specific compassion of someone who understands why it came, and the specific clarity of someone who knows it is not the answer to the question they are actually asking. The silence worked, not because silence is a strategy, because your silence was the first genuinely honest communication the dynamic received. More honest than everything that was said. More honest than the reaching and the trying and the patient, generous, increasingly depleted giving. The silence said the one thing that the relationship could not have continued without hearing, that your presence is not guaranteed, that your availability is not unconditional, that the person standing on the other side of the avoidance management was a real person with a real limit, and the limit had been reached, and the consequence was real. Real consequences are the only input the avoidance system updates from. You provided the consequence, not as a strategy, as the simple, honest, entirely human result of having finally run out. And the system, encountering for the first time the consequence of what the pattern produces, not the theoretical consequence that could always be managed against, but the actual, lived, specific consequence of the specific person who was loving them, actually, completely, without drama or declaration, gone, updated, and moved. Toward the person whose silence finally said the thing that every word before it had been too gentle, too hoping, too willing to absorb the cost to say. That you were worth more than what was being offered. That the offering needed to change. That the return, if it was going to mean anything, had to come from somewhere real.